we're getting around to talking about the ancient and very exciting, I think, two-book theory of knowledge in this video, but allow me to build slowly toward it. If you're coming in from the most recent video on this channel, you've just heard that we're often hanging out here in the border country, as I call it, between theology and psychology. And let's say that you too like the idea, like I do, of traveling in the border country. And that despite the dangers that I described to you last time in that border country, you'd like to get the gleanings from both countries, as it were. And if so, that's great. But there's still the problem of how on earth to fit together the wisdom of both countries, of both theology and psychology. As a native of theology land, that's how I describe myself, I'm really interested in those places where the countries overlap, where they perhaps say different things, but things that don't actually contradict. So, is there any easy way to integrate the wisdom of both countries, of both theology land, as we're calling it, and theology land, with integrity and without slipping into some kind of new agey relativism? There might not be an easy way, but I'd like to toss out a brief introduction to one very time-tested way, a very simple but still very helpful way of thinking about those two sources of knowledge. Knowledge about people, knowledge about God, and how we can use both of those sources. Because the sources don't always contradict, not at all, and in fact they often enrich one another. And so here we go. This is a helpful key that has been called the two books theory, or the two books theology sometimes. Here's what it means. God reveals things to human beings through two sources, through the book of Scripture, but also through the book of nature. And those are the two books. One book is what's also historically been called special revelation, which is the utterances of the prophets and the apostles in written form in the Bible. But also within that book, within the book of Scripture, God seems to also invite us to learn from another one of his books, the book of nature, which could also be called the book of empirical studies, or the book of science, or the book of what our senses and our experiences can teach us. The book of clinical trials even, if you will. In the common parlance, in the two-book view as it's been known, book one actually is the book of nature and book two is the book of Scripture. So I'll just stick with that ordering from here on out in this video. The earliest source of the two books view might be Psalm 19 itself, where in the first two verses it says this: "The heavens declare the glory of God, the skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech, night after night they reveal knowledge." And so there, friends, is book one, the book of nature. It's the heavens, it's the skies, it's nature itself pouring forth speech and revealing things. Now, what is book one revealing? What are the things book one is revealing? Well, it's things about God, yes. It's also things about who we are as human beings, because we are made in the image of that God. Now, later in that psalm, in Psalm 19, there's a transition to the book two source of knowledge, the book two source, the book of Scripture, when it says in these words in Psalm 19, "The law of the Lord is perfect, refreshing the soul. The statutes of the Lord are trustworthy, making wise the simple. The precepts of the Lord are right, giving joy to the heart. The commands of the Lord are radiant, giving light to the eyes." So that's all book two stuff. It's God's revealed law. It's his statutes. It's his precepts. It's his commands. Things that human reason, or book one, couldn't arrive at on its own. Notice, by the way, that the effect of book two, what is the effect of book two? Its contents has a certain effect on the human heart. It doesn't just shed intellectual light. It does do that as well, though, but it goes beyond mere intellectual light to refreshment, Did you notice the language? To wisdom, to joy, it says. If you want to hear another great statement of the two books view, you need to meet a man named Guido de Bray. He was a Protestant who lived in Belgium, actually, at the time of the Spanish Inquisition in the 1500s, which is not a great time to be in Belgium if you were a Protestant. The Spanish Inquisition, completely apart from the Monty Python sketch, was actually in the business of rooting out people from various splintering non-Roman Catholic groups and then putting them on trial for heresy. And at that place and time, the punishment for heresy was death. So Guido de Bray had an idea. He thought, if I can somehow just convince the Spanish crown that we Protestants are not insane, or at least that we're not dangerously insane, maybe they'll lay off us. And so in the year 1561, he got out his pen and he wrote something that we now call the Belgic Confession, which is a simple statement of core Protestant beliefs. It's really a beautiful piece of writing on its own merits. The Belgic Confession became, in years after de Bray's day, a widely used theological summary, and it's even used in the present day as a statement of belief in various Christian denominations. At the time of the writing, though, at the time that de Bray wrote it, his only goal was very, very narrowly to just somehow get a copy of this statement, this confession of belief, into the hands of King Philip of Spain, really as a way of saying, look, read this. We Protestants are not crazy heretics. Here's what we believe. I've written it all down here for you. And you might notice that it's not so different than Catholic theology in many points. So could you just please call off the Spanish Inquisition? Now, one of the questions that he addressed in his confession was what he said, the quote is, how a person comes to know truth. Truth about God, truth about humanity. And de Bray's answer took the shape of this two books theory that we're talking about here. Everything he said about the two books view in the Belgic Confession should have been, in Guido de Bray's own mind, a totally non-controversial claim. It would be something that Christians of every stripe have always believed, something they could all agree on, something that, in his time, that Catholics and Protestants should be able to agree on, and that the scriptures had always very clearly taught, and that's a big point. His point, and my point, for sharing all of this, is that his two books idea is really, really old, and it's foundational for Christian thinking on how to bring together scripture and empirical observation of whatever kind. Theology and psychology in our case. Empirical observation, those book one type discoveries, could be made by anyone, even if that person didn't personally catch that there was a connection between their scientific knowledge and the divine giver of that knowledge, the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and Jacob. Now look, it would be a bummer, according to de Bray, and I would say the Bible, if a research psychologist didn't see the connection to God as the author of all truth and whatever they're discovering. But nevertheless, their discoveries themselves would still be true. So, back to our story. On the night of November 1st, 1561, de Bray put on a disguise. He rolled up a copy of his newly minted confession. He snuck out into the streets by the darkness of night. He snuck past some guards, and he threw his confession up and over the castle wall of Tournai. All of this in the hopes of bringing it to the attention of the Spanish government and putting to rest some of the Inquisition. Now, I would have loved to tell you that this story ended well for Guido, but very sadly, his efforts went unheeded by the king. And even worse, he was caught and given the death penalty by the Spanish Inquisition. So it really, unfortunately, blew up in his face. The good news, though, and there is plenty of good news, is that his Belgic Confession did survive him. And it went on to make a really big mark in the history and the development of Christianity in the West. And here's what he said. Here's what Guido de Bray said about the two books view, which I want to give you. And this is from Article 2 of the Belgic Confession. You can find it online anywhere. The title of that article, Article 2, is The Means by Which We Know God. And what he said was this: we know God by two means. First, by the creation, preservation, and government of the universe, since that universe is before our eyes like a beautiful book, in which all creatures, great and small, are as letters to make us ponder the invisible things of God. That's what he said. Okay, that's the first book. That's the book of nature. All creatures, all people, even the humblest animal that you could imagine are somehow living, visible words which are clues to the nature of even God himself. This is what has also been called general revelation. But Guido goes on to say, and here's the quote, second, he says, God makes himself known to us more clearly by his holy divine word, as much as we need in this life, for God's glory and for our salvation. Okay, that's book 2. That's the Bible he's talking about. To tie this all up, God reveals things about himself and about humanity using two books. One book uses God's works in the natural world and really does require our observation. It requires even the scientific study of it in some cases. And the other book primarily uses God's words, words which come to us through the scriptures. It's really worth pointing out that the contents of the first and the second book in this view do not contradict each other. They're not some kind of competing sources of information. They harmonize, to say the very least. But the book of Scripture specializes in the deeper questions of human meaning. And it specializes in the ultimate purpose of life in a way that the book of nature can only be much more vague. And that's why secular psychology textbooks, when they keep within the bounds of Book 1 knowledge, won't make too many claims about the ultimate meaning of human life and the ultimate meaning of morals and things like that. You also won't find the meaning of life by mapping how neurons work, as important as it is to do that. You won't map the meaning of life by studying how trauma affects the brain, or by learning about neurotransmitters, as important as those fields of knowledge are. However, both books are still God's books. We need both in our library. You could say, following Psalm 19, that the heavens, book 1, declare the glory of God, and also the heavens declare something about the glory of humanity who was made in the image of that God. Yes, they do. But the heavens will only give you so much information about the big cosmic purposes of God, or the big purposes of people like you and I. You'll eventually need to temporarily put down the telescope or the microscope and open the book of theology, open the book of Scripture, open book number 2. And it's there that you'll find a whole lot more content about all of that stuff that the second half of Psalm 19 is referring to. It's in book 2 that you'll find out about the ultimate source of what refreshes the human heart, the ultimate source of what gives a human lasting delight. In that second book, you'll discover that the way that the human psyche is most grounded is not merely when the cortex is regulating the limbic system in the abstract, but no, and if you can follow me on this, the cortex is only really humming when it's been filled with specific conscious thoughts about God's favor toward us, when it's filled with realizations about the love of Christ for us demonstrated on the cross, when it's filled with ideas and revelations about God's strength and mercy that he happily exercises on our behalf. And then when that God-soaked, theologically charged up cortex, it can then, in a way, minister to our anxious limbic system with some of these really potent and soothing words that come from the scriptures. Put another way, these gospel truths are deeper cortical messages than the book of nature could possibly provide to us on its own. But both books, and hear this, both books have something to tell us. Imagine a person looking at a Bible and finding the phrase in the Old Testament, "The Lord rejoices over you with singing." If that book 2 knowledge about the Lord's joy over us is going to make any real impact on us, it's because at the mechanistic level, it's because our cortex sends that phrase, "God rejoices over us with singing." It sends that phrase down into our anxious midbrain, and it creates some limbic soothing. It promotes a mood of joy and a sense of safety and an attitude of devotion. And that brain mechanism is in accordance with how the book of nature tells us that our brain functions. But both book 1 and book 2 were necessary for that. A while ago, I was reading some of the psychoanalytic literature on the value of surrender for mental health. You could say it was a book 1 explanation of how when we somehow surrender ourselves to something or to someone outside of ourselves, it's really just good for us at a lot of levels. It's book 1. It's a book 1 observation. But it would only be in book 2 that we learn that it is to whom we surrender, ultimately. The divine whom that we surrender to. That the greatest gains and the greatest reorientation of our lives take place. So, if you want to know what makes a human being tick, if you really want to know, you'll have a lot to gain from opening both books, the book of theology and the book of psychology. Since God wrote both books, and since he invites us to build our knowledge from both books, we'll become, unfortunately, shallow unless we're accessing both. If you're a book 1 fan, science and reason, but you never read book 2, your view of human nature will come off as mechanistic. It'll come off as determined and materialistic. And if you're in a special book 2 fan, like I am, a fan of the scriptures, a fan of theology, but you don't do any homework at all in book 1, you'll become hyper-spiritual, you'll become vague, you will lack a kind of pragmatism, and it'll seem to many like your feet are just floating above the ground. Some of the videos in this channel will deal more with the book of theology. Others will trade more in the book of psychology. But the assumption here and the big grand point to keep underlining is that either way, we're wrestling with God's truth and how that truth positively impacts and describes human people like us, no matter from which book we're getting it. Get it? That's it. It's the 2 books view of knowledge. It is incredibly powerful. It's old and time-tested, as I said. Hopefully, it is a view that is now your friend too. Consider it. All right. We will see you next time, and thank you for listening.